Hi guys, and welcome to the first episode of the third season of The Inexplicable. Happy Halloween to everyone. Yes, my favorite day of the year has finally arrived, and with it begins a new, truly exciting chapter for The Inexplicable. Get ready, this season will be special. I'm not just talking about podcasts, there will also be YouTube videos returning, and a major shift in social media content. And a completely new project, which I'm sure you'll fall in love with, and that will come to life in no time. In the coming days, I'll release a YouTube video sharing all the details and a behind-the-scenes look at this new project. But today I want to make room for Halloween, and for a topic that, as soon as I heard about it, immediately caught my attention. If you've been following me for a while, you already know that the origins of Halloween are much older and darker than we might imagine. In fact, it originates from Samhain, the ancient Celtic New Year, a night when the boundary between the living and the dead became thin and spirits wandered among us. What is now a game of trick-or-treating was once a set of disturbing customs and beliefs, mysterious, dark, and sometimes even bloody. Today I'll introduce you to 7 of them, and calling them spine-chilling is an understatement. Are you ready? So here are 7 disturbing rituals that were used to celebrate Halloween. In ancient times, as I was saying, Samhain, the Celtic festival that gave rise to Halloween, marked in ancient times the end of the harvest and the beginning of the colder, darker season. It was the time when the Celts believed that life and death intertwined, and that the spirits of the dead returned to walk among the living. The Druids, priests, and keepers of knowledge played a central role in this context. They lit the sacred fire, led purification rituals, and protected the community from dark presences. Homes and villages were surrounded by symbols and barriers to ward off evil spirits, while offerings of food and wine were left to appease wandering souls. Halloween was therefore not born as a cheerful celebration, but rather as a moment of real contact with the world of the afterlife, an occasion in which fear, superstition, and respect for the unknown governed every action. But how was this night celebrated when real fear and superstition dominated people's thoughts? Well, let's see it together. To predict the future. Let's begin with some of the softer rituals, if we can call them that. Today, when we think of Halloween, we think of lit pumpkins, candy, and scary costumes. But at the origins of this holiday, during Samhain, the night was very different. It was filled with an unsettling sense of mystery, populated by rituals meant to reveal the future or summon spirits. Rituals that today would seem curious to us, if not downright unsettling. One of these was reserved for girls searching for their future love. During the night at Samhain, they would hide near their neighbors' houses, filling their mouths with water and holding a pinch of salt in their hands. Silently, they listened to the conversations of those present. The first name of an unmarried man they heard would be that of their future husband, or at least that's what they believed. Apparently not, it wasn't true. But if we imagine this scene taking place in the middle of the night, immersed in an atmosphere of tension and fear, surrounded by superstition and anticipation, the ritual takes on a surprising, almost surreal aspect. The young boys, on the other hand, had even stranger and more fascinating rituals to predict their future. In one of these, they would open the barn doors and mimic the gesture of letting the corn fall against the wind 3 times. After the 3rd repetition, a spirit was said to pass through the barn, taking on a form that could suggest the social or work position the boy would occupy in adult life. However, a warning was given to prevent any unpleasant surprises. If the barn doors were not reopened immediately, the spirit would remain trapped, ready to torment whoever had summoned it. These are just 2 examples of the many divinatory rituals that once enlivened the night of Samhain. Some light and playful, others mysterious and full of tension. However, they all had something in common: the fascination with the unknown, the desire to glimpse among the shadows what fate had in store. On that ancient night, Halloween was not just a celebration. It was an open door to invisible worlds, an opportunity to look beyond one's own reality and beyond the boundaries of time. For the Celts, there was no need to be a medium or a skilled fortune teller to know your own destiny. The ritual killing of kings. The icy heart of the Irish bogs where time appears frozen. Archaeologists and scholars unearth remarkably preserved bodies and mummies that have withstood centuries. The skin still taut, the features clear. Even fine and soft hair seem to belong to someone who has only recently fallen asleep. They are not simple remains. They are traces of an ancient dark ritual intimately connected to the festival of Samhain. Many of these bodies weren't there by accident. Their elegant clothes, well-groomed hair, and precious jewelry suggest that they belong to the ruling class, perhaps to kings or figures of great power. In Celtic legends, in fact, it is said that during Samhain, when the veil between worlds grew thin and spirits walked among the living, sometimes an extreme sacrifice was performed. The king's ritual killing. According to tradition, the prosperity of the year depended on the king himself. He was more than a man. He embodied Earth's fertility, the sun's strength, and life's continuity. If the year had been harsh, if the rains had destroyed crops or famine had struck the villages, the blame fell on him. The failed king, therefore, had to die. The sacrifice was solemn, terrible, and full of symbolism. The king's blood was poured onto the earth so that it could restore its strength. His body was thrown into the swamp, a borderland suspended between life and death, so that he could rest between the two realms, becoming a bridge between the world of the living and that of the dead. The king represented the dying sun, the light that fades to allow the new cycle to be reborn. Samhain marked the end of summer, the sunset of the year, and through that sacrifice the community hoped to ensure the earth a new beginning, more fruitful and secure. The victim, noble and precious, it was the most important bargaining chip, the greatest coin, the reward. Chilling, yes, but logical. According to their view, if the ruler was not able to provide for his subjects in life, maybe he would do a better job in death. Dark fairy abductions. On Samhain night, Celtic legends say the dark fairies, members of the Sida, the fairy folk made up of gnomes, fairies, goblins, and other mysterious creatures, would leave their underground dwellings to roam freely among humans. But be careful. These were not the delicate winged creatures of modern fairy tales. They were ancient, ruthless entities, deeply connected to the realm of the dead. It is said that on that night, led by the king of the dead, they would ride among the stormy clouds, accompanied by an army of hellhounds in search of souls. Originally, they only gathered the spirits of the dead, but on that special night, their criteria became more unclear, or perhaps more cruel. Sometimes even the living ended up among the damned. Anyone who was outside after sunset risked being kidnapped by the fairies and dragged into their underground realm, a timeless place from which almost no one ever returned. To protect themselves, the Celts carefully avoided the fairy mounds, the hills considered gateways to the fairy world. Simply getting too close meant being captured and pulled into a hell of endless light and music, where the soul would be trapped forever. But not everyone could stay safe at home. Thus, two ancient traditions were born, leaving offerings, milk, honey, small portions of food, to appease the wrath of the Sida, and dressing up in disguise. People would disguise themselves as spirits, monsters, or fairies, hoping to trick the dark creatures into believing there was no one left to abduct. A simple gesture born out of fear and superstition that has survived through the centuries. So, behind the colorful costumes and the smiles of children who knock on doors on Halloween night, there is a disturbing origin hidden. The desperate attempt not to be mistaken for humans and taken away by the dark fairies of Samhain. Cathartic drunkenness. During the ancient festival of Samhain, one of the most widespread and, in some ways, definitely unsettling practices involved the consumption of alcohol. But be careful, I'm not talking about simple festive toasts. The Celtic peoples drank until they completely lost touch with reality, until they reached a state of deep trance. There was a specific reason for this ritual. Samhain marked winter's start and the harvest's end. With the last reserves of grain and fruit, huge quantities of beer and mead were produced as they couldn't be stored for long. So the villages gathered around bonfires and held real ritual feasts. They ate, danced, and above all, drank without restraint. But alongside this practical reason, there was another, deeper and more spiritual one. Drunkenness was not seen as a sin or weakness. It was a gateway to the other world. The Celts thought alcohol freed the mind from rational limits, helping them connect with spirits, receive messages from the afterlife, and sometimes communicate with the dead. It's no surprise that many prophecies and visions arose during such periods of complete mental alteration. Every ancient Irish tale about drunkenness takes place during Samhain. There's even a folk tale called the Drunkenness of the Ulstermen, in which the whole story revolves around excessive drinking during the festival. Almost like a collective ritual, a spiritual catharsis. And so, on that night suspended between life and death, between the world of the living and that of the spirits, intoxication became a way to dissolve the boundaries of reality. Drinking until falling into a trance meant, in a way, becoming like the spirits themselves, free, bodiless, and perhaps infinitely closer to the afterlife. La Scrofanera. As I have already stated several times, the central idea on which the celebration of Samhain was based was belief. That, at that particular time of the year, the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead became incredibly thin, almost transparent. In that darkness full of omens, fire therefore took on a profound meaning: protection, purification, a barrier against evil spirits. The communities lit large bonfires to drive away dark entities, but some individuals didn't stop at that. In certain regions of the British Isles, young people took part in trials as ancient as they were daunting. In Scotland, for example, boys would go from house to house asking for peat to burn the witches, gathering enough material to light a huge communal bonfire. Then they would lie down next to the flames, letting the smoke surround them, convinced that the acrid smell would protect them from demons. But it was in Wales that the ritual took on an even darker and more frightening form. At nightfall, everyone would run around the bonfire, jumping through sparks and smoke. Whoever was left behind was doomed to face something terrifying. That is, to draw upon themselves the fury of the so-called Black Soul. That is, the Black Sow, a demonic creature, half beast and half spirit. According to legend, it would emerge from the shadows to chase after the very last runner, dragging him away into eternal darkness. The Black Sow embodied sin and death, the divine punishment for those who dared to challenge the darkness. But behind this popular belief, there is also a deeper meaning. Some scholars argue that the Black Sow was nothing more than the personification of the fear of the dark, the collective terror of the unknown, which during Samhain became more intense and real. Some say this story is just a diluted version of a much darker ritual. Ancient Celtic tales say that, centuries ago, the group running around the bonfires wasn't just playing a game. The participant in last place was actually caught. He was symbolically loaded with all the year's evils, and then mercilessly thrown into the purifying flames of the bonfire, like a human sacrifice. These are stories that have never been possible to confirm with certainty, but neither to completely deny. Whether the black soul was an infernal beast or the metaphor of a forgotten sacrifice, one thing remains clear though: the heart of the Samhain night. When you found yourself running around the fire, it was definitely better not to be the slowest, to play the role of death. This is the only ritual, if we can call it that has mostly been preserved over the centuries and is still widely practiced today. During the Halloween celebration, what has changed concerns only the reasons why it was carried out in ancient times. Imagine a cold and foggy night in the countryside of ancient Ireland, which is the night of Samhain. Spirits walk freely on the earth, passing through villages and forests, and people must find a way to survive their passing. How would you protect yourself from danger? You'd stay inside your house. Well, that strategy might work, but it wouldn't guarantee total protection from the spirits. The solution most people came up with was different. To dress as death itself, people who disguise themselves as spirits, lost souls, or demons. They didn't do it for fun like we do, but to blend in with the dead. They wore the skins of freshly slaughtered animals, skulls, and straw masks with monstrous features, hoping that the wandering spirits would mistake them for one of their own and leave them alone. The Samhain celebrations coincided with the Great Autumn Slaughters. The farmers slaughtered the livestock to stock up supplies for the winter, and the cries of the dying pigs marked the beginning of the festivities. From the carcasses, primitive and terrifying costumes took shape, made of bones, horns, and blood-soaked furs. Just imagine for a moment how grotesque the resulting scene could be. Brutal, but effective. An infallible way to escape the restless spirits that were believed to wander in the darkness. Over time, this custom lost its magical meaning, but its spirit surprisingly survived. Today's Halloween masks, face paintings, and costumes are all that's left of that old scary ritual. A faint memory of people dressing as the dead to avoid becoming one themselves. The sacrifice of children. And I couldn't finish this overview of beliefs and rituals without mentioning the scariest one of all. The one that stands as the ultimate symbol of the deep darkness surrounding this celebration. The sacrifice of young victims to gain the favor of the gods. Let's be clear. There are many doubts about the truth of these practices. Some consider them real, while others prefer to believe they are just legends. An exaggeration meant to further obscure the already mysterious Celts. It is said that in ancient times during Samhain, the gods demanded a terrible price. The people had to offer 2/3 of everything they owned, the crops, the livestock, and, in extreme cases, even their children. In an ancient monastic tale, there is mention of a place called Manschlecht, where a stone idol stood dedicated to a dark deity, Crom Crouch, the bent lord of the mountain. They say human sacrifices occurred at that altar on Samhain night. The monk and author describes terrible scenes. Parents who killed their firstborns amid screams and wails, then poured their blood around the idol. But how much of all this is believable? Well, modern historians suspect that many of these stories are the result of Roman and Christian propaganda created to demonize the beliefs of the Celtic peoples. The Romans in particular often described the Druids as bloodthirsty savages, ready to sacrifice human lives to appease cruel deities. Yet concrete archaeological evidence of actual child sacrifices during Samhain is, first of all, scarce, but I would say almost non-existent, perhaps more legend than real fact. These legends were symbols, a way to represent the ultimate sacrifice, the most painful renunciation, as a form of protection against death and the dark forces of winter. After all, If during Samhain the veil between the living and the dead truly became thin, it's not surprising that in the imagination of that time, offering a life might have seemed like the only way to save many others. A terrible hypothesis, but it reveals a past where fear of the unknown and the need to survive merged into one unsettling belief. In short, there was a time when Halloween wasn't about candy, costumes, and colorful lanterns, but about real fear. Rituals, ancient sacrifices, invocations, and beliefs that tried to make sense of the darkness, the cold, and death. Man, in an attempt to appease invisible forces, created ceremonies that today would seem terrifying to us. But in the end, they all came from the same instinct, the fear of the unknown. Over time, those rituals evolved. Torches and sacred fires turned into candles and pumpkins. The masks used to scare away spirits turned into playful costumes, and the offerings to gods and the dead became candies, treats from dark celebrations full of superstition and mystery. We've arrived at a colorful celebration, filled with laughter, costumes, and irony. But behind the orange lights and painted smiles, Halloween still preserves something ancient, a shadow that has accompanied us for millennia. Because in the end, Halloween has changed, but its essence remains subtle. A fascination with fear and the world of the dead that seems to touch ours once a year. And now the floor is yours. What do you think? Had you heard about these customs and rituals before? Which one of them seemed the most unsettling to you? Let me know in a comment. The Unexplainable podcast is an original format, written and directed by Luca Perella, with sound design by Matteo Alessandro. If you enjoyed this episode of the third series, leave a like, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, or share it with your friends. Greetings, and see you at the next appointment with the Unexplainable.